Welcome to my Civil War videos. My name is Jason Brown. I'm with Boone County 4-H, and the reason I put these together was for my 5th grade students and to present the Civil War to them. I'm hoping that everyone that sees these will enjoy these and learn something about the Civil War and the persons who were a part of it. This video, you're going to actually see camp life, what it was like for the soldiers, Union soldiers in camp, what they ate, and some of the things related to their life there in camp. As we said before, oftentimes the living arrangements for sleeping was pretty primitive. You have your blanket, and again, like we said in the summertime, this is something that they really didn't need, but in the wintertime this comes in handy. They had their gum blanket there on the ground. Seems like that would be tough to live with or be able to sleep with, but again, you want the very basics when you're on the march a lot, and all you really need is these two items. It gets really cold. A lot of soldiers were issued greatcoats. A lot of soldiers would come together and form what we call messes, and you could at night in the wintertime spoon or cuddle with your messmate and be able to do that and just be able to keep warm. Privates in the Union Army would be paid the sum of $13 a month, and normally they would be paid bi-monthly. Sometimes, if the soldier was on the march and in an area of danger, or if they were just separated from certain logistics, they could go months without being paid. And oftentimes soldiers would end up getting a lump sum at pay time. Be a very exciting moment for them. As we said with our previous videos, they would oftentimes be excited about taking that money and going to the sutler, or taking that money and going and beginning to gamble. Some soldiers would do the right thing and send some of that money home to their family, and they would do certain things like that, or they would keep it. Oftentimes soldiers sometimes wouldn't get paid at all because they were actually in debt to the sutler. And because they owed the sutler, oftentimes their pay they would receive on payday was very minimal because of what they owed the sutler. And a sutler is just simply a store that follows along with the army during the time in which they're on the march and on the move. And a sutler could provide certain goods and items they could purchase. Most money at that time was going to be banknotes and gold coinage, but in 1862, to continue the war effort, there was an act passed that began to print out paper money. And paper money at that time, they referred to it as greenbacks. The reason they referred to it as greenbacks is, well, it's pretty simple. The printing on the back was green, solid green. On the front there, even though this is early days as far as printing out money at the time by the federal government, quite a bit of detail there you can see. Now, the person on here is the Secretary of the Treasury, that's Salmon P. Chase, and so that's who's on the money there. Obviously, our currency today has presidents and people like that. $5 bill, Alexander Hamilton on that, and again, has a green back. Lincoln is actually on the $10 bill, and you can see that there. And then $20 bill looks like that. Early in the war, because of the fear about the economic impact of the war, people began to hoard gold coins and other and silver coins and that type of currency that the federal government had issued. They began to hoard them, and so there was a great supply. The supply of that gold coin within the mainstream sort of markets and things like that was greatly diminished. So in 1862, the U.S. Postal Service begins to issue what's called fractional currency, and there are these tiny little notes here. And at the beginning, when they began to issue these fractional currencies, they would actually put actual real stamps on them, but eventually they would begin to just print them straight away with just the image of the stamps on them. And that's what they would use in place of coinage, would be this fractional currency. And so that's what they would use to make change. Because again, you know, gold coins and silver coins the government had issued had began to be limited as far as being used in day-to-day life and activity. And so you could use fractional currency there to make your change. The fractional currency, it's really a fascinating read, but it's a bit complicated because it has a lot to do with market fluctuations and things like that, that even for a knowledgeable person might be a little bit hard to understand. But you get a look at the fractional currency they might have had to make change in lieu of the gold currency they would have had at that time. So let's talk about rations. Soldiers would be issued basic military rations, especially when they were out on the campaign. Now, if they were in camp, they could get things like fresh meat. Sometimes there were accounts of soldiers building baking ovens, and they would have fresh bread. But if they're out on the march, they have to subsist on the very basic. Their meat ration is going to be salt pork or bacon. It's called salt pork because it would be cured in salt, and oftentimes by the time it gets to the soldiers, it's very salty. Sometimes the cure doesn't take, and it gets to the soldiers, and it's actually beginning to decay a little bit. Now, what I've brought today is the demonstration piece, is a piece of bacon. Now that's a little bit bigger than the soldier would be issued as a daily ration. The daily ration of bacon or salt pork is going to be about a pound worth. This bacon, it's off the bottom side of the hog, and so oftentimes it's going to be not much meat and a lot of fat. It also oftentimes would come with the skin on top, and what soldiers would do is they would cut that skin off, just like you've seen demonstrated here, and they would use the oily side or the fat side, and they would rub their rifle down because that oil would keep the rifle from rusting. And obviously you want a rifle that's in good shape, good working condition, and they would actually use that side of the skin to kind of grease that rifle down. Now, to get the salt pork going, oftentimes the first step would be a soldier would cube it up like you see here in the picture in the video, and they would boil it to try to leach a lot of that salt out. And even after leaching the salt out, it would oftentimes still be incredibly salty. We're going to have this is a half canteen pan is what this is. Oftentimes if a soldier's canteen broke, he could actually split it into two halves and use one of the halves as a baking pan. Now what we're going to do to make sure that the salt pork doesn't stick to the bottom of the pan is we're going to simply put a little bit of water in it just to keep it from sticking, otherwise it obviously will. And we're going to place that there on the fire. So we're going to situate that a little bit. Now, doing that, obviously we're blowing a lot of ash everywhere, but soldiers in the field, not something I'm terribly concerned about as far as eating. You can already hear it begin to sizzle and cook. If they're on the move on the march, their bread ration issue is going to be hardtack. It's made of flour, water, and salt. The soldiers would joke that it's so hard it would stop a bullet. Really looks about like an oversized saltine cracker. Oftentimes they would call them teeth dullers, they'd call them worm castles, because a lot of times they would arrive from soldiers and they would arrive with bugs and weevils inside of them. And soldiers would have to find a way to eat these. Now, one of the easiest ways to eat these was they would boil some water, maybe stick it down inside the cup and boil it. Oftentimes what they might do is if they really didn't have a way to eat it, they could take their rifle and break it up. And so a soldier could take his hardtack, and he could take his rifle butt, something hard, and break the hardtack up so that he could be able to eat that and consume that. Trying to eat a whole piece is pretty hard, but once you break it down into these smaller pieces, oftentimes it becomes a little bit easier to consume that. They would be issued about a pound or about 12 crackers of this every day, and that would be their portion. So we've got our salt pork cooking right now, and you can hear it there on the fire. Christy, you might want to stir it. Got our hardtack. Maybe soldiers weren't happy with the food that they had at the time that the Army issued to them, and they were looking for a change, and so they pass an apple orchard. Maybe they take the apple from that orchard, or maybe if they pass a garden that someone had, they grab some carrots and some things like that. Now, to be honest, that was essentially stealing from those people, but soldiers didn't think along the lines of those kind of ideologies. They thought they needed food and they were going to take it, especially when it came from taking food and supplies from the enemy, because they felt that was a justifiable way to sort of hurt the enemy and hurt their ability to continue the war. Christy's going to demonstrate how they would grind coffee. Now, coffee is the most important thing that a soldier would have. Probably his favorite ration. Just like us today, we wanted that caffeine fix. We want that ability to stay awake if you're going to do picket duty at night or go on the long march. And soldiers had to have coffee. Now, one of the ways they would make their coffee is they would put the whole beans there in the cup, and they'd use their bayonet. Now, we said bayonets didn't have many military applications, but they sure came in handy in camp. So he's going to use his bayonet there to crush the whole beans up so that they're ground down, so to speak. We're going to then add water to them and put it on the fire to boil. And so Christy will just demonstrate that. Takes a little bit of time, but it's definitely worth it. Now, as a side note, while he's doing that, many times soldiers on the march didn't have time to boil their coffee. And again, they want their caffeine fix. And oftentimes, what they would do, even though they weren't happy with it, is they would oftentimes just eat the grounds directly. Because if they couldn't boil water, they still wanted that opportunity to get that sort of fix, we might say. So after Christy has done that, we'll go ahead. He's going to take and pour the water in there and get it ready to put it on the fire to boil. One thing I forgot to mention earlier is a soldier would have been issued a haversack, and a haversack is a waterproof bag for which he would carry his rations in that bag. He could carry other personal items, but more or less it was made for the rations to be carried in. Looks like the salt pork is about ready to come off the fire, and when we pull that off, we're gonna move our cup of coffee right down here to see if we can't get a little bit more fire on that. And you're gonna obviously want the salt pork to cool down a little bit. Once it's cooled down, be able to eat that. Now, just eating it for a day or two like we do at Living History events, not a big deal. But if you eat this for a long period of time, you do get pretty tired of it, especially as greasy as the salt pork can be, and you get tired of the hardtack and things like that. But generally speaking, this would have been their main Army rations.